Most mysteries are solved relatively quickly and with answers that are relatively expected. Even with some unsolved mysteries, it can be easy to assume a simple solution without investigating any further. In these cases, those simple solutions were proven wrong by unexpected twists in the mystery. Number 5. When someone is put behind bars for a crime they didn't commit, the damage of this miscarriage of justice is felt by all parties. The most obvious is the person who lost their freedom. Some people spend years or even the rest of their lives in prison for crimes they didn't commit, but it can also hurt the victims and their families, who are left without justice for the crime. Most of the time, when an innocent person is released from prison, it means that either the police are working on finding the true criminal, or they've already uncovered the truth. But in the case of Zhao Zhensheng, when the man who was convicted of taking his life was released, there was no hunt for the real culprit. Zhao Zhensheng was in his late 40s in 1997. Living in the Chinese village of Zhaolu, the area was not known for its wealth. Most of the people living in the area made their living through farming, but that was getting harder and harder due to over-farming. Apparently though, Zhensheng had slightly more money than most. At least he was able to loan money to one of his neighbors, Zhao Zohai. Despite the family name, they had no relation. Zhensheng allegedly loaned 1,800 yen to his neighbor. The money would have been worth about half a month's income for a state worker. For some reason, Zohai couldn't or wouldn't pay the money back, and the two men had a falling out over the incident. There were also rumors that Zohai was having an affair, which also upset Zhensheng. On October 30th, 1997, the two men got into a fight. Zohai was hit hard, but Zhensheng completely disappeared. Months went on, and Zhensheng's family didn't hear from him. In an era before internet messaging services were popular, it was much harder to reach out to someone who didn't live in the immediate area. But Zhensheng had apparently shown no indication that he was thinking of leaving. Also, if he'd left of his own accord, his family would have expected him to send a letter of some kind to let them know that he was alright. By the time Zhensheng's nephew reported him missing in February of 1998, his family believed Zohai had something to do with the disappearance. Without a body though, it's unlikely that the disappearance would ever be solved. In May of that year, workers made a horrifying discovery while digging a well near the village. It was the body of a man, though his head was missing. Immediately, people believed this was the missing Zhensheng. There were no other recent disappearances in the area that could explain the body. What remained of the remains was a close enough resemblance to Zhensheng that his family were able to confirm that it was him. No DNA test was taken. There was still no concrete evidence pointing Zohai to the crime. But he was the only person known to have problems with Zhensheng. He was arrested, and both he and his wife were questioned by authorities. According to Zohai, he was forced to make a confession, and his wife was forced to admit that her husband had taken Zhensheng's life. At first, it was deemed an accident, but he was later charged with deliberately taking the life of another person. With his confession, he was found guilty and sentenced to life in prison. That sentence was later reduced to 27 years due to good behavior. Still, it looked as if Zohai would spend the rest of his life behind bars. It would have remained that way if a new piece of evidence hadn't emerged. On April 30th, 2010, Zhao Zhensheng reappeared in the village. He was partially paralyzed, but his sister, niece, and other villagers all confirmed this was really Zhensheng, who had supposedly passed away more than 20 years earlier. Zhensheng explained that he'd hit Zohai so hard that he believed he'd been the one to have taken a life during that fight. He'd fled from the scene and cut all contact with his family. He had only returned because he'd suffered medical problems that left him partially paralyzed, and he needed to come to the village to claim welfare payments. A retrial was set up, and Zohai was found innocent of a crime that was never committed. Unfortunately, his wife had remarried in the years that he'd been in prison. He was given some compensation, though it only amounted to about 650,000 yuan. Number 4. Richard Bennett and Rick Hills had a lot of similarities, but their missing person cases should never have been connected. Richard and Rick lived only a few miles from one another, in and near the village of Soldotna on the Kenai Peninsula in Alaska. The village is home to a little over 4,000 people, and it's likely that Richard and Rick would have bumped into each other as they went about their daily lives, even if they didn't know one another. Rick was 35 in 2004. Richard was 38. They both wore similar clothing and had even suffered similar leg breaks when they were younger, and they both disappeared within 15 months of each other. Rick vanished first. On February 24, 2004, he was driving home after picking up a check from work. He never made it back, and his truck was found 2 days later. He'd hit a snowbank and seemed to have wounded his leg. Investigators followed footprints to a nearby abandoned airstrip, where all track of Rick ended. Rick's family also lived in Kenai. His father was an electrician, and his mother helped run the business. He had a long-term partner, Heidi, and they had 3 young children. Rick worked on an oil rig and had only been home for a few days when he went missing. He had asked if his children wanted to go with him when he set off for Anchorage to pick up his paycheck. They refused, so he went alone. When Rick's vehicle was found, his wallet and cash were still on the front seat. There was no evidence that anybody else had been involved in the incident, and it looked like Rick had walked away himself to find help. His family thought it strange for him to get lost in the woods. He was only 15 miles from Soldotna, and he knew the woods very well. It was possible that he'd hit his head during the crash and gotten confused, but if that was the case, they expected he wouldn't have been able to walk far. Despite many official and unofficial searches, no trace could be found. It was a little over a year after Rick disappeared that Richard vanished. Richard lived in a trailer on the outskirts of the village and was known to be a bit of a loner. He cared a lot about his family, especially his aunt who also lived in Alaska, but it wasn't uncommon for him to go long periods of time without speaking to them. He also didn't have a stable job. The last anybody had heard from him, he'd been looking but wasn't optimistic about his chances. He was last seen in May of 2005. On the 27th, he took the last $10 he had in his bank account and wasn't seen again. It was August before his disappearance was noticed, and his family went to his trailer to search for him. Most of his belongings were stored in a shed, labeled to be given to various friends and family members. Missing were Richard's camping gear and his weapons. It looked as if he'd decided to leave his old life. Richard's neighbors had noticed some birds circling nearby a few months earlier. They thought the birds had found the body of a moose or some other wildlife, but now they suspected it might have been Richard. His family searched the area and found the remains of a man. The skull was missing, but the man was wearing the same clothes Richard was known to wear. The leg bone showed an old wound that had healed, and forensic anthropologists said that it was consistent with the wound that Richard had suffered years earlier. For the police and Richard's family, there was little doubt that this was him. The police still wanted to do a DNA test, but it would be months before they could get the results. The body was released to Richard's family, and they had a funeral service for him. Meanwhile, Rick Hill's family continued to search for answers. In 2014, they finally got answers, but not in the way they expected. The Funny River fire destroyed a huge amount of land not far south from Soldotna. As firefighters worked to try to control the blaze, they came across the remains of a human male. It was impossible to say how he had passed away, but it was clear that he had been there for some time. The police looked through the missing person cases they had, and it was only then that they discovered the DNA results for the remains that had been given to Richard Bennett's family. The test confirmed the remains didn't belong to Richard Bennett. After conducting more tests, police realized that those remains actually belonged to Rick Hill. The remains revealed by the Funny River fire also weren't Richard Bennett. Instead, they belonged to a man named James Allen Beaver, who'd been missing since 2011. Rick and Richard's families were both told of the mistake. An urn containing Rick's remains was given to Rick's family, but there were still unanswered questions. They don't know how he passed away or whether foul play was involved. Rick's skull has never been found. Richard's family has even more questions. Richard has never been found, and now it seems possible that he might still be alive. His camping gear has never been found, and he might be out living in the wilderness somewhere. Richard's case is still listed on the NamUs database. He was 5'7" when he disappeared, weighed 180 pounds, and had brown hair and blue eyes. He suffered a motorcycle accident when he was younger that fractured his shin and calf bones. Anybody with information about this disappearance can contact the Alaska State Troopers at 907-269-5511. Number 3. On New Year's Eve 2009, a security guard opened the Cantini Museum in France like normal. Everything seemed to be in place until he came to the room where an exhibition on art with theatrical themes was being held. There was an empty spot where a small painting called The Chorus should have been. This art theft mystery baffled investigators. The stolen painting had only been a small piece, measuring 27 by 32 centimeters. It was created in 1877 by Impressionist artist Edgar Degas. From 1929 onwards, it was stored in Paris. It was then loaned to the Cantini Museum to be part of an exhibition on art with theatrical themes. It was only a few days before the exhibition was set to end that the work was stolen. There was no sign of a break-in, but someone had managed to get into the museum and unscrew the frame containing the chorus. The thief or thieves had then fled, leaving behind no evidence or clues for investigators to work on. The police suspected it was an inside job, and the night watchman was arrested and interviewed. He was later released without charge, and there was no actual evidence that he was involved. The police were left with many questions. Not only was the who a mystery, but also the why. There were many paintings in the exhibition, but only a single one had been stolen. The chorus was worth roughly $1.14 million. While a considerable amount, it wasn't anywhere near the most valuable of Degas's works. Police wondered if the criminal might try to ransom back the artwork, or if it would end up in a private collection. With few clues to go on, the case went cold. It would have remained that way were it not for a strange twist that came 8 years later. On February 16, 2018, police stopped an inner-city bus on its way to Paris. It was about 30 kilometers away from its destination and looked like any other bus shuttling people across the country. But it was these sorts of buses that smugglers used to transport illegal substances. Every day, the police would do random checks to see if they could stop the smugglers. They went through the luggage on the bus and were surprised with what they found. It was the small pastel art piece stolen years earlier. Nobody on the bus claimed the suitcase that the artwork had been stored in. Nobody seemed to know how or when the case had gotten there. The painting was taken to a museum and authenticated, and it was the real stolen Degas piece. The museum was delighted that the painting had been found. It was in relatively good condition, considering the fact that it had been missing for so long. It wasn't long before the painting was back on display for art lovers, presumably with tighter security surrounding it. There were still plenty of unanswered questions in this mystery, though. The police were never able to determine who the luggage belonged to. The passengers on the bus were not closely questioned, and it's possible one or more knew more about the mysterious package than they told police. It may also have been that someone had accidentally left the luggage on the bus when they left at an earlier point. Why it was being moved was also a mystery. It's unlikely the owner had simply decided to take it on a bus trip to Paris for no reason, but that reason can only be speculated at this stage. Since the painting was discovered, the police have released no new information about the crime, and it may remain an unsolved mystery forever. Number 2. There are many crimes and heists that seem to mimic stories from Hollywood films. Some of these crimes genuinely are inspired by fiction, while fiction is often inspired by these audacious crimes. But there's no other crime that looks more like a scripted heist thriller than the theft and recovery of the Madonna with Child. Today, this particular Madonna and Child painting is most famous for its theft, but even beforehand, it was very important to Venice. It was painted sometime in the early 1500s. In 1991, it was hung 14 feet off the floor in a room where it was the focal point. It was surrounded on all sides by paintings of the Censori, which seemed to look at the Madonna with Child painting. It was a symbol of the Venetian Republic getting its authority from God and was very important. So when a janitor noticed it was missing on the morning of October 9th, 1991, the police desperately wanted to get it back. It was soon revealed that this wasn't a simple theft, but part of a much larger story that had an even stranger ending. Venice had problems with crime at the time. The Mala del Brenta was the criminal organization that ran things in the area between the 1970s and 80s, led by Felice Maniero. By the start of the 1990s, the police were starting to close in on Maniero and his associates, and in 1991, one of his cousins had been arrested. Maniero was also under special surveillance. He was looking for a way out. While Maniero had a love for art, his gang didn't have a monopoly on art crime. In Venice, there was only one man associated with high-level art thefts, Vincenzo Peppino. Peppino had been a thief for most of his life. He had developed a reputation both for being very skilled and for having great taste. But most of all, he was known as a gentleman thief. He would always return the artwork that he had stolen for a finder's fee. Despite being a known criminal, he had a good relationship with the police. They were happy to look the other way, so long as the art was returned and nobody was hurt. Some of Peppino's victims even saw being hit by him as a sign that they had good taste in art. When the Madonna with Child was stolen, authorities knew who to suspect. It wasn't Peppino's style, but he was the only person talented enough for the job. The authorities were right. Peppino was behind the theft, and it wasn't his usual job. Peppino had actually been approached by Maniero to complete the job. At first, Maniero had wanted to conduct a violent heist, and had requested Peppino's opinion on which art to steal. Peppino had managed to convince the mafia boss to let him do the job alone and without violence. He had entered the palace in the daytime, following behind a tour group. He then snuck into one of the palace prison cells that had not been used since the 18th century. Peppino waited there until about 2 a.m. He then went into the room with the famous artwork, used a stepladder to get the piece, and escaped through a side exit. There was only one clue left at the crime scene. He had left a shoe print in the dust beneath the painting. When Peppino realized this mistake, he threw those shoes into the lagoon. The painting was handed over to Maniero before the police came to visit Peppino, but it wasn't the only heist the mob had planned. A more brutal heist had taken place at a church in the nearby city of Padua. Armed men had broken into the shrine of St. Anthony and stolen a holy relic, the saint's jawbone. The plan had been to ransom this priceless artifact back to Venice, in return for Maniero's cousin being released. Peppino hadn't known about the plan to attack the church and was disturbed by the act. He didn't like that his own careful work would now be so closely associated with something so brute force. He was also very superstitious and had a real fear of ghosts. Stealing the body part of a saint was not a good look. The police were also angry with Peppino, as they believed this theft went too far for him. He promised them that they would have the painting back in 20 days. What happened in the intervening 20 days remains a mystery. Peppino has told many stories. One version is that he simply went on vacation and had nothing to do with the recovery. In an autobiography, he wrote that the plan had always been to return the artwork in 20 days, and everything had gone according to plan. In an interview with a journalist from Epic magazine, he told a hypothetical story about him breaking into a shed belonging to another one of Maniero's relatives. He had to avoid 2 tigers to do so, but managed to steal back the painting, replacing it with a fake. The story played on some rumors that had been spread about Maniero long ago, including that he owned 2 tigers and was known to store stolen goods in that area. But after telling the story, Peppino insisted it was only hypothetical and he had nothing to do with the return. Whatever the case, the painting was returned to the authorities. In a press conference on November 7th, the police claimed they'd received an anonymous tip that the painting was on the mainland and recovered the artwork. Maniero later used the holy relic to negotiate his cousin's release, only to later help authorities take down the organization that he had helped to build. Peppino has spent the last 30 years building on his legacy, and now uses his experience to work as a consultant, advising organizations on how to avoid thefts. Number 1. Revel Bal disappeared without a trace in November of 1994. Since then, both of her parents have passed away, but her sister has continued to push for answers in this strange and twisting case. Revel was 22 years old in 1994. She was a dancer who had only recently gotten into modeling, but had already seen success in this career. She'd made it onto the cover of Fashion magazine and had made arrangements to go to Japan to work as a dancer for 6 weeks. But unknown to her family, Revel was earning money in other ways. She worked for a service called Select Companions, an agency that advertised companions to wealthy clients. It was run by then husband and wife, Jane and Zoran Stanojevic. According to Jane Stanojevic, who now uses the surname King, Revel was known for being pretty unreliable and selective about her clients. It was a business that Revel was looking to get out of. She planned for November 5th, 1994, to be her last day on the job. Select Companions had arranged a client for her, a man named Gavin Seymour, whom she'd met at his home in the Kingsford suburb of Sydney. It was supposed to be a 2-hour appointment, but Seymour paid her for an extra hour. After that, Revel was supposed to meet 2 of Stanojevic's friends at another hotel. King had expressed to her how important this meeting was, but Revel never showed up. King apparently wasn't surprised by this, and arranged for someone else to take her place. Stanojevic's friends weren't the only people who Revel was supposed to meet that night. She had a friend named Kate Brentnall, who arranged to meet up to get drinks after she finished work. Revel called Kate at 7:15 to say she was leaving her client, and she'd be at a specific bar in about an hour, but she never came. According to Seymour, he dropped her off at a nearby Red Tomato Inn around 7 p.m. At first, he claimed he went in with her and they had some drinks, but that story later changed to her going in by herself while he went to a bottle store before returning home. The owner of the bar claimed that he never saw Revel that night. The next day, Revel was supposed to take a train to Newcastle to meet her mother before she flew to Japan. But again, there was no sign of her, and Revel's mother reported her missing. Some of Revel's belongings were found scattered around the Kingsford neighborhood. One of her shoes was found in a bin, while the other was on a different street. Her keys, diary, and plastic cradle for her pager were all found, but none provided any clues as to where Revel was. Seymour became a person of interest, but for some reason there was no forensic search of his home or his car. This was despite the fact his girlfriend had noted that Seymour had cleaned the car the weekend Revel went missing. Seymour has never been charged with anything, and it seems he's no longer a person of interest in the case. In the almost 30 years since Revel vanished, there have been countless rumors about what happened to her. Some seem to think that one of the agencies she worked for had harmed her. Stanojevic and King told conflicting stories at an inquiry into Revel's disappearance. King claimed she was unreliable, but both denied any involvement in her disappearance. Years later, in 2023, King told the media that she had evidence that the police had never found. According to King, this evidence proved that Seymour had nothing to do with the disappearance. She hasn't shared what she believes really happened to Revel or who might be responsible. There was another update in 2021. Police had received an anonymous tip and had now issued a photograph of a man that they were looking to speak to. They didn't share any information about how he might be connected to Revel's disappearance, but they believed he might know something that could help solve the case. The photograph was taken sometime in the 2000s. At the moment, it seems that there's only rumors about what might have happened to Revel and no solid evidence. One thing her family is certain of is that she didn't disappear herself. Revel left behind her passport and plane tickets to Japan. She was at a stage in her life where there were good things on the horizon and had no reason to leave behind her family and friends. An inquest determined that she'd likely had her life taken by persons unknown. There's a reward of up to $1 million for information in this case. Anybody with information can contact Crime Stoppers at 1-800-333-000. Thank you guys so much for watching. If you liked this video, be sure to hit that like button. Also, don't forget to subscribe and click that notification bell to keep up to date with all of our future uploads. But my name is Ty Knotts, and I'll catch you guys in the next video.